Hi everyone, this is Dennis Williams, and here today we're talking about the development of global religions in the ancient world. And again, this is a supplemental episode for the World Civ 1 class at Southern Nazarene University. And today we're talking about religion, and that's an interesting topic in ancient history because there are lots of different varieties of religion that are interesting to talk about. For instance, we have the Greco-Roman religions of the gods and goddesses that people know a lot about, Zeus and Apollo, Diana, Helen, and others that make up the body of the Greek myths. But we also have the development of this monotheistic tradition, these Abrahamic religions that come from Western Asia. And when we go further east, we also have the development of some interesting kinds of evolutions of religion in Hinduism and the development of merger philosophy of Buddhism as well. Many of you have read about that, and what I want to do now is kind of talk about some sort of larger issues related to the development of these global kinds of religions. So first of all, let's think about what a religion is. A religion is a system of beliefs and worship of some kind of superhuman controlling power that is oftentimes seen as a personal god or gods, but may be seen as a sort of a larger impersonal force, perhaps, even when it's coupled predominantly with the worship of that particular deity or that particular superhuman controlling power. And so when we think back about the development of ancient religion, one of the things that we can look back to are these distant tribes and evidence for their worship. A lot of these tribal peoples start out in an animistic context, and in that animistic context, I think what we see is the worship of spirits, spirits that are very local, that may inhabit various features of the landscape, rock forms, trees, plants, animals. Some of that, I think, is accessible to us when we think about particular Native American religions, where Native American peoples at the time of the conquest of the Americas would report on, going on spirit quests in which, they would find their totem animal that would, sort of be their the medium between the spirit world and the physical world in which the person existed. These shamanistic religions then develop where there's an intercessor, kind of a specialized person in society who, is that go-between that can harness or communicate with spiritual forces and then bring that to the good of the community. Those shamans over time, probably 6,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, slowly evolved into a specialized priesthood as civilizations got more complex, as we develop agriculture and agrarian societies, and these priesthoods then begin to build temples to particular gods, goddesses that are local. And so you might have a temple and a set of priests that are particularly attentive to the concerns, needs of the fertility god or goddess. Most of the time that would be a goddess, or the sky god, or the god of the hunt, or any of these other sorts of superhuman controlling beings that would help out these fragile humans who were up against the forces of a hostile and complicated world that they didn't really have a lot of control over. These religions, though, begin to get, I guess, a lot of friction begins to happen inside of these religions as these groups of people begin to grow, begin to expand, and their religions bump up against each other. So we worship our God over here in our community, the God that stays in, or the spirit that stays in this particular rock form that's nearby our village, and you have a God over there, and that's all fine. But what happens when one of us conquers the other? Things can get complicated. And so oftentimes, as you thought about this last week when we talked a little bit about empires mean that there's a lot of diversity. There are conquered peoples, and so religion became kind of a force of conquest. And so you would see, perhaps the Persians conquering and having to deal with the conquest, these conquered peoples, and what needs to happen with religion. So one of the things that the Persians had done, being sort of monotheists themselves, or at least dualists, believed in forces of good and evil. They began to interact with people and began to say, well, you can worship your own your own religion as long as you pay your taxes back to us. And so you have this sort of pluralism that begins to develop. Inside of that pluralism, though, comes these forces of integration or unification, where some people begin to look and they begin to say, y'all talk about your gods in this way, and we talk about our gods in that way, and you have a fertility goddess and we have a fertility goddess. I wonder if maybe those fertility goddesses are perhaps the same one. And so there are movements that begin to combine these various gods and goddesses and sort of bring them up into a common deity with different names depending on the particular location, the particular locale in which people are worshiping them. One of the things that happens then, interestingly, in Western Asia, is we have the development of these tribal religions that are very monotheistic. So Judaism is an example of this. So you would have Abraham, who definitely comes out of a Mesopotamian civilization with a whole host of gods and goddesses and a mythology all around them. But Abraham and his descendants typically tend to worship one particular god in that pantheon. Yahweh, this deity comes to be called. There are lots of other gods and goddesses that other people are worshiping, and there's certainly an openness to the fact that they worship their God, but our God is different. Our God protects us, our tribe, etc. As the Jews become this people who move in and out of various kinds of captivity, they pick up a lot of philosophical concepts, a lot of other religious concepts, practices of worship, and those sorts of things. By the time the Roman Empire conquers Western Asia, one of the interesting elements there is that the Romans bring in their Greco-Roman gods and goddesses. Certainly the Hebrews had bumped up against those people at an earlier time, had a bit of an understanding of their deities, but rejected that notion of polytheism, the multiple gods and goddesses, and they held on to this idea of monotheism, of this one God that, the God of Abraham, that Abraham made a covenant with, those kinds of things. And so they held on to that monotheistic concept. But we begin to see then in the Roman period that there are that being on the inside, being an insider, part of the priesthood of a particular culture, leaves a lot of people on the outside. And so you have this big Roman Empire. There's a certain kind of order, Peace of Rome, Pax Romana, which was probably just order. And there are different perspectives on worship, and lots of different little sects begin to arise that see worship of Yahweh a little bit differently. Some of them much more austere and extreme, and others are much more sort of embracing of a bit more pluralism. One of the things that happens then is that out of this Jewish culture emerges Christianity, which is also a monotheistic religion, looks back to Abraham, this God of Abraham, and yet it takes on a new form as the Son of God, Jesus, is crucified, resurrected, and this small group of Jews, initially Jews, begin to worship this Jesus, this Son of God. And as they do it, a new religion is formed, and it becomes Christianity. And it's pretty different. It's very localized in different areas of Western Asia, of North Africa, as these Christian disciples begin to spread throughout the Roman Empire. These various Christian groups take on some of the characteristics, some of the practices perhaps of other religious communities that perhaps converted to Christianity. And so there's some real interesting kinds of things that emerge in the ferment that Christianity develops in. Christianity develops in a lot of different ways. From the perspective of the Romans, though, Christianity is not really even a religion. It's like atheism, because it's not recognizing, and like Judaism was not recognizing, the gods and goddesses of the Greco-Roman Empire as being legitimate. And so, from the Roman perspective, a couple of things were going on there. One is these folks don't believe in the proper gods and goddesses, therefore they're atheists. They worship a weird god. Secondly, in times of stress, when you need the people to all be righteous and worshiping the proper God, so that God can bless the kingdom, bless the empire, these folks are outsiders, and they're heretics, and so that creates a rub between these Christian communities, Jewish communities, and the larger Greco-Roman culture. That gets worked out, as you know, with the conversion to Christianity of Constantine. And so we begin to see then that Christianity becomes this sort of dominant religion inside the Roman Empire in the 320s through the 370s AD. And as this begins to develop, there are others who find themselves a little bit outside of the power base there, and certainly in the fringe communities of southwestern Asia. What emerges there is another group of monotheists, another group of people who point to the God of Abraham and say, well, that's our God, but we go to that God through a different tribe. So it's not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's Abraham and Ishmael. And so these Arab peoples to the south, they see their access to God coming through this sort of religious tradition that comes down through time through Ishmael. And the prophet Muhammad, sort of a young man, kind of a bit of an outsider, part of the merchant community there, has a revelation of Allah, the God of Abraham, who reveals himself as presenting a new revelation, the final revelation, recognizing that, yes, there was Jesus, he was a great prophet, yes, there are all these other Hebrew prophets out there, but the one true prophet was Muhammad. Now, what's interesting about looking at this lineage from Judaism to Christianity to Islam is that these universalizing religions transcend the tribe. They go up above the tribe. They say, you know what, like we have these tribes, but at the same time, we recognize that we're in this diverse group of people, and so maybe there are ways that we can consolidate or sort of strip down or sort of build a core around the fundamental religious concepts that we have that can alleviate the frictions between the tribal identities and the cultures of these various tribes. And so you see, in Judaism, all these various religious practices about cleanliness, etc., and Christianity sort of wipes that away and says, well, that's a particular kind of Jewish tradition there. Not going to worry about that. Instead, what we're going to focus more on is sort of this philosophical construct, maybe a few practices like taking the Eucharist and those sorts of things. In Islam, a much more mobile people, they begin to say, well, that's pretty complicated. You have to believe some pretty sophisticated philosophical perspectives to really appreciate what Christianity is about. It's very rooted in agricultural communities. There's bread and wine in the Eucharist. You have to go to a church. You have to take these rituals, these rites from an ordained priest. But what if you're on the road? What can you do? And so Islam strips monotheism down even further and says, there's really just a couple of core beliefs. One of those beliefs is that there is one God, Allah. Muhammad is his prophet. And the second is, and Muhammad is his prophet. And then there are these various practices, these styles of worship that you have to do, and they're all pretty portable. They include things like, giving alms to the poor. Well, the poor are always with us, so wherever you might go, there's a poor person, so you can give a little bit of your excess to that poor person. You have to, sometime in your life, if you're able, make a trip to Mecca, make a pilgrimage to Mecca and go see this place where, there's this meteorite that fell from the sky to show Abraham where to set up the house for Ishmael and his mother. And so you have these practices like that. that are pretty easy to do, that don't praying 5 times a day, for instance, facing Mecca. That's one of those practices. And so, there's these devotional practices, but they can be done anywhere. Don't have to be done in a church. Don't have to have a priest necessarily to be able to practice these things. And so a much more stripped down, core kind of religion that appreciates monotheism and at the same time provides access to people from lots of different cultures to join in and be able to carry on their own particular cultural practices. Maybe there are some dietary practices that are pretty common, like not eating pork, let's say, something like that. But a Muslim traveler by the name of Ibn Battuta traveled across North Africa, going to Mecca, made this pilgrimage, looked at all these different Muslim peoples as he traveled along, down into to East Africa, visiting various and sundry Muslim communities, and he found that their dietary traditions, their traditions around modesty, their traditions around marriage, all these things varied quite a little bit because there were these local communities who had their own practices, and they were able to keep them because all they really had to do was hang on to those 5 pillars of Islam. And so those are some of the things that I hope to sort of point out to you as you think about these universalizing religions. So they tend to be absorptive. They're able to sort of take in a lot of the cultural characteristics of the cultures that convert to them. They tend to simplify religion down to some really core elements so that it's less difficult to embrace it by people who are interested in embracing it. Oftentimes the people who convert to it are a little bit outsiders. They're not people who are, devoted at the very core of their own religion, but they're maybe economic outsiders, maybe political outsiders, maybe cultural outsiders, and so they're willing to embrace this other kind of religion that's sort of new. And I think that they tend to emerge in these highly diverse societies. When we go to Asia, one of the things that we see in particularly India is these very tribal kinds of animistic, polytheistic religions that emerge. And over time, Hinduism grows up into this place where there is this sort of one Godhead, the Brahman, and the various and sundry polytheistic gods in the various places throughout India become, in some ways, the faces of Brahman. So, Brahma is this sort of universal spirit and manifests himself, shows himself to all kinds of people through these various and sundry local cultural gods and goddesses. And there's an economic component to that with worship and with sacrifice and, all of those kinds of things. So one of the things that, and by the way, as you've read, Hinduism has this element to it, this belief system built into it around reincarnation, that if you act well, when you die, you come back as a higher being or a better being or a being that's sort of better off in the world to learn some new things. If you act poorly in the world, then you come back as a lesser being so that you can sort of learn what you need to learn from life in order to progress upwards. In the sort of early phases of the development of Hinduism, there's really no way out. There's the soul is being recycled all the time, and so this Hindu by the name of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, known as the Buddha, thinks his way through this and develops this philosophy that essentially says, there is a way out. It's called nirvana, and nirvana it comes to a person, or a person comes to nirvana, if you would, the state of nirvana, by ceasing to desire anything, because suffering is caused by desire, and and life is all about suffering. And so to get out of suffering, you have to stop desiring all of these trivial things that seem to occupy our minds. And a way to do this is to observe yourself on the interior. Notice when you're desiring these crazy things and you're just listening to your mind go on and on and on, and you recognize this is just kind of ridiculousness. And so you begin to strip down and strip away all of those various things, and perhaps in this life or perhaps in another life, by the constant devotion to meditation, to generosity, to giving of yourself and giving away yourself, you might ultimately come to the very core, to the very essence of the universe, and cease to exist, and therefore escape the life of suffering that is the common facet of all people. And so this becomes then a philosophical system that many people find hope in, but they continue, and oftentimes throughout Southern Asia, Southeastern Asia as well, to adopt the Buddhist sort of principles and adopt this sort of Buddhist perspective, but they turn it into a religion that worships the Buddha. And so there's this sort of Buddhist philosophy, and there's also the worship or the religion of Buddhism, in which there's sacrifice and all of these various and sundry cultural and probably, growing out of a local community kind of setting. And again, the imperial, conquests of South Asian peoples throughout the region spread Buddhism and also spread Hinduism throughout Southeast Asia. In China, the Chinese Empire of the various dynasties that work their way through the Qin and the Han, they adopt, by the time the Hans are there, they are adopting Confucianism as this sort of governing philosophy. And it's its own interesting thing. It's a philosophy. It's not exactly a religion, but some people worship Confucius over time, so it becomes religious, kind of a cult. But it is certainly the philosophy of the bureaucracy, of the government. And so if you're going to get anywhere in life and you want to be a government official, then one of the things that you're going to do is you're going to learn how to write. And one of the ways that you're going to learn how to write are these ideograms, and there are thousands and thousands of ideograms that one has to learn how to write. Remember, in China, there's not an alphabet that make up sounds, but there are ideograms, those symbols that actually stand for a concept. And so, you're writing all these concepts, memorizing them, learning how to write them down. And the way you do that is through writing these various and sundry Confucian philosophical elements. And in so doing, imbibe or really sort of memorize or bring into your heart and mind through the practice of education these Confucian concepts. And then the test that one takes in order to become an officer in the Chinese bureaucracy is a test on Confucianism. And so you're sort of given an exam in which you have to, answer questions that relate to, these various Confucian principles. And so, as a result of that, Confucianism then becomes, this sort of upper class, dominant philosophical system throughout East Asia. Wherever the Chinese dominate, there is Confucianism. Particularly for the elites. And if you want to be a member of the elite, you're going to adopt Confucianism. But there are a couple of but Confucianism is a little stale. There are a couple of other philosophical traditions in China. Taoism, for instance, which is kind of this very private philosophy, become one with nature, fit yourself into the rhythms of the natural order, and find some hope in that. Or many people then also practiced, Buddhist philosophy or even Buddhist religion among the lower classes in China, if they weren't simply practicing this very localized and sort of normal throughout the world during this period of time of ancestor worship, of venerating the spirits of the dead who may inhabit the place around you because their graves are right there. So there's lots of religious stuff going on here, but the ones that we're focusing on with civilization are these universalizing religions. Universalizing mean they're able to bring in lots of different people on a very small core of beliefs and assimilate these people and bring them into a similar worldview. And with that similar worldview, harness the energy of people to say, hey, we all belong together. And in our belonging, we belong through this overarching culture, a culture that has a religious base to it. So those are some concepts I think that you might be interested in, and I think I addressed several of your questions along the way. And I thank you, and I'm looking forward to reading your essays and answering your questions for next time. Thank you very much, and this is Dennis Williams, over and out.